Hello, it is Siddig. Welcome to just learning math, I guess. I'm going to show you today how to solve polynomials by completing the square or using the completing the square method. This might get me in trouble with other teachers, but here's the trick. I really like completing the square. That's not the part that would make people grumpy. But the trick is, completing the square to me is a method that you only use in certain situations. So you can complete the square in lots of different situations, but if you have an alternate method, then I wouldn't use completing the square when it's going to be more challenging. So this would be a really good completing the square problem. Two reasons. The first is that the number in front of here is a 1. All right, when you complete the square and you have to have a number, or you do have a number in front, it's a little more painful because what has to happen is you have to divide everything by that number, and that can turn into some weird fractions. Now, if that was like a 2, that would be okay because they would all divide evenly. But if it's a 3, that's not going to be very nice. Now, you can still complete the square. It is still completely possible. But it's just one of those things where if you have another method, why use completing the square when it's just going to be more painful? The other time that I wouldn't be real crazy about completing the square is if the middle number here is an odd. Because what happens is to complete the square, you have to take the middle number and divide it by 2. You can deal with this as a fraction or a decimal, but as a teacher, I've seen that students struggle with that. And even if they're fine with math, there's still that, like this, there's like a internal angst about fractions, and students are more likely to make a mistake. So to me, if this had a 7 in the middle, I would probably still complete the square. But if you as a student hated fractions or were uncomfortable with them or even weren't crazy about decimals, you might think about using an alternate method like quadratic formula or checking to see if it's factorable. All right, so this is a method I prefer because I find it to be a quick method, but the problem is it's not always a quick method. So it just is one of those things where as a teacher, I don't generally force students to use completing the square where it's going to be a painful process because there are other methods. All right, and to me, the idea is you want a student not to be thinking about how stressful it is to answer something with completing the square. They should be thinking about what is the best method for me to use, because to me, that's the critical thinking. Like when you are an adult human, you don't go into a situation and go, well, there's a faster way to solve this, but I'm going to use the worst method because that's what would be like what somebody would tell me to do. Do you know what I mean? I don't know. Just to me, it seems silly. So if you know how to quadratic form, this first step is the opposite of quadratic formula. If you don't know how to quadratic formula, I have a video on it. But for this one, the first thing that you do is you want to solve this so that you get the x's or the variables or whatever together, and then you want your c value to be on the right-hand side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract that 20 on both sides. That's going to give me, yes, thank you, 12 on both sides. That's going to give me 8x squared minus 8x. The 12s will reduce to 0, and then 20 minus 12 is 8. Sorry about that. You want to move the 12 to the 20, not the 20 to the 12. If you were doing quadratic formula, you would move the 20. Now, and as I get better at this, or as you get better at this, or if you want to, you can combine these first two steps. What I will usually do now is this is where I will put in my placeholder. I put in a plus blank and a plus blank on both sides because what's going to happen in completing the square is you're going to force this polynomial to be a perfect square trinomial. Sometimes there are definitely plenty of people in books that will have you do a plus and a minus on the same side, and you're more than welcome to do that. So if you already have this as a process and you were just checking it out to see, how I did the method, I'm not saying that this is the only way you can do this. I just have found as I've taught it that this seems to be the method where students lose the least amount of numbers, for me anyway. But, whoever you are, you use the method that works best for you. This is just the method that I generally show, but if you are one of my students or you are a student that has questions about it and you'd like to see it in its alternate method, I can show you that. I just think that this way it's a little bit more clean cut, and you're not, like, sometimes it just throws kids off to think of this. Right? Because then people start to think, like, why in the world are you adding and subtracting the same number? Okay, you're still going to get the same answer. All right, it just is, and some people will even leave c on the same side. All right, I'm just showing you the method of completing the square that I prefer and that I think is the most straightforward. Okay, now that I have those blanks, I need to fill them in with something that will complete my square. So what I always do is I take my middle term, I cut it in half, and then I square it, hence the completing the square. Now, you might be asking yourself, why do you have to cut it in half? It's because I'm making a perfect square trinomial. A perfect square trinomial will look like this. So the middle term is always twice these two multiplied, like these two square rooted multiplied. So the idea is I need the number here that is going to be half of this number squared, because that's the format or the order of a perfect square trinomial. So in this case, I'm going to put a 16 here and a 16 here. Now, you can also think of it as you're looking for the number that is a perfect square that its factors will give you the middle number, which in this case is going to be this 4 right here. So that's the other nice thing about completing the square is it gives you what to fill in your completing the square location, and then it also gives you the factors that multiply to positive 16 but add, subtract to negative 8. So then I factor, I should write that stuff. Now, you can factor it and then condense it, or you can condense it in one step. I will show you both. This is if you are uncomfortable with condensing it right away. 16 and 8 make 24. If you don't feel like you need that extra step, you can remember that they'll always factor perfectly because we force them to be perfect by doing this step here. So you can always get rid of that second one and put the little square there. All right, from here on in, this is solving using radicals, or solving using, they call it the square root property, I think is what they call it. There's like a property or a theorem for it, and I can't remember what it is, but it's when you have it set to something squared equals a number, you can just solve. So I do my lovely dotted line to show my separate sides. To opposite operation, a square is a square root. So I'm going to square root both sides. The square and the square root on this side, they eliminate each other because it's opposite operations like add and subtract or multiply and divide. That gives me x minus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 24. Now, 24 is not a perfect square. Normally what you would do here is you would reduce it, and I'll show that to you in a second. But if you are just learning the process and you're just trying to get the hang of it, all you would do now is move this 4 over to get the x alone. So you would get x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 24. Can you see that okay? All right, it got a little squished. Now, the problem is, if you're really working on a math problem, or you're taking a standardized test, or you're working, for a true solution, that's not going to be a good enough answer. So what you have to do is you have to do the radical properties again. Now, if you are currently taking my class, we haven't looked at the radicals yet. It is something you are supposed to already know, but my concern right now is, can you get through the process? All right, if you can get through the process and you're not sure how to do the radicals, don't panic yet, because it's something I'm going to show you. If you are like, I need to get through the radicals, what you do is you take your 24 and you factor it. And what you're looking for in your list is the biggest perfect square that 24 has as a factor. So these are not, well, one's a perfect square, but it's not very big. Not perfect square, not perfect square. And what you're allowed to do with a radical is you're allowed to break it up into its factors, which then lets you square root each individual piece. The square root of 4 is 2. So my official answer should be 4 plus or minus 2 root 6. Okay? Now, if you made it here, right, you got 9/10 of the way through the problem because you did all the completing the square parts properly, and what stopped you is a radical simplification. All right? So hopefully this helps with completing the square. If you feel like you would like to see a more complicated completing the square, or you'd like to see a problem that like you're being encouraged to complete the square on and it's not a very nice problem, or it's got fractions in it and you'd like to see me do one of those, you can leave me a comment and let me know. All right. I like completing the square because I personally find it to be a fast method, and I think it's kind of a pretty method, as pretty as math can be. But if you are just attempting to get an answer, you might like the quadratic formula better, okay? So the trick with solving polynomials is there are multiple methods to do it. The more of them you know, the faster you can solve. So it's kind of like, do you need to have your multiplication tables memorized? No. But will it make doing math in high school especially a lot faster? Yes. Do you have to know completing the square? No, you can survive Algebra 2 without knowing how to complete the square. But if you know the method, could it possibly make your math life faster? Yes. All right, so have a lovely, lovely rest of your day or evening or whatever you're doing right now. If you would like to subscribe, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. If you love completing the square and you'd like to like the video, go ahead. If you have any comments or questions, you can comment below. All right, have a lovely day.